Thanks everyone for being here. I am Cecilia Ricap. I am IIPP's head of research, and also I am an associate professor in economics. And I've been since I entered IIPP, actually organizing this book presentation series where we invite young scholars that are doing a great work, not only as scholars and in their careers, but really engaging with big, deep questions that require to write books and not simply to be writing a set of papers, and with that in mind and thinking in terms of what are the topics that are relevant for us as IIPP, but also for our contemporary challenges for the students at our Masters in Public Administration, is that we've been curating this set of discussions. And today I have the pleasure to be hosting Dr. Ilyas Alami's book presentation, the Spectre of State Capitalism. As you know, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose gives, it's really inspired by, among others, our director, Mariana Mazzucato, and her work, Rethinking the State, and all of us in our work, in the way in which we approach economics and political questions, we are constantly reflecting on what's the role of the state, how the state works, what's the interplay between corporate and political power, and also what are the differences among states, and trying to distinguish different types of states. And on top of that, how to, in a way, engage in opening up what state means, and the different, not only dependencies of the state, but also what states can do in its different departments, and why not also in its state-owned companies. And precisely speaking about that, I have the pleasure to have today Ilyas presenting his book, and Miriam as discussant, who is doing her PhD and spending part of her PhD time here with us. But also, Miriam Nobre works at Embrapa, which is one of Brazil's state-owned companies. So I wanted her to be a discussant of Ilyas' book, to try to also establish an open space for dialogue and for co-creating more ideas and knowledge inspired by Ilyas' book, but also by your own experience, both at your work and as a scholar. So without further ado, I will just leave the floor to Ilyas, and who will be presenting his book. Then we will listen to Miriam's comments, and of course then Ilyas will have some time for replying or expanding on the basis of what Miriam will be saying, and then we will open it to all of you for questions and exchanges with them.
All right, well, thank you so much, Cecilia, for this very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I see some familiar faces. Pleasure to be here. It's nice to see so much interest in the topic of the role of the state in the economy, and state capitalism in particular. The book I'm presenting today is here, the Spectre of State Capitalism. Let me see if I can make this work. Yeah, I might just stand. I did a master's at UCL about 11 years ago, and I had a great time. It was not at IIPP, but at the development planning unit just around the corner. Had a great time. So it really feels unreal to be back at UCL to present a book that I've written. Anyway, so the book is called The Spectre of State Capitalism. It's co-authored with my good friend and colleague Adam Dixon, who's a professor at Heriot-Watt University in Scotland. We spent about 5 years researching and writing this book, so we're really happy that this is finally out, and we're excited to present it and to have a discussion about it. Here's a hard copy. You can buy it if you want. It's very expensive. Otherwise, you can just download it for free. The book is open access, which we think is important. Okay, so let me dig right into it. So the book really is about state capitalism. If you read the financial press, you will probably be familiar with the term state capitalism. So according to the Western financial press, as you can see from those covers here, state capitalism really is a new model of capitalism which allegedly comes from China and other emerging economies. It's also other emerging economies like Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey, Russia, and others. And it's this presumed new model of capitalism where the state allegedly plays a disproportionately strong role in the economy, is presumed to be upending market, introducing market distortions, and fracturing the global economic consensus, as Rana Foroohar puts it in the Financial Times. So overall, again, according to the Western financial press, the new state capitalism is located in emerging economies. It's also allegedly a model which is radically different from the capitalism that, again, presumably predominates in the West, which is supposed to be more free market oriented, more democratic, and so on. And it's also supposed to be a threat to the international liberal order. Okay, so this is the type of representations that you see about state capitalism in the financial press. Now, according to Western policymakers and state leaders, you see a similar understanding of what state capitalism means. Here's a quote from US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. He says, "We should insist on competing in a rules-based system that protects our people from the aggressive state capitalism of modern autocracies." So here, the opposition between supposedly virtuous democratic free market capitalism from the West versus, malevolent, bad state capitalism from the East is very explicit. Likewise, so this is a quote from the Trade Policy Review of the European Commission. The Trade Policy Review is the sort of broad, it's a document that outlines the broad policy orientation in terms of trade of the European Commission. This says, "The rapid rise of China, demonstrating global ambitions and pursuing a distinct state capitalist model, has fundamentally changed the global economic and political order." So again, you see this narrative about this new state capitalism coming from the East and from China in particular, disturbing the global political economy. And obviously, this is perceived as a threat that has to be tackled. Now, what we argue in the book is that this is a very limited and partial understanding of what state capitalism is. And in fact, we argue in the book that state capitalism, or rather the story of state capitalism, is the global story. Far from being limited to emerging economies, contemporary state capitalism is a global phenomenon, and I'll explain in a second what that is. Oh. Okay, here we are. We're currently witnessing a historic arc in the trajectory of state intervention, is one of the key claims we make in the book. And again, this historic arc has to be understood as a global phenomenon. And this historic arc in the trajectories of state intervention is characterized by a drastic expansion of the state's role as a promoter of capital accumulation, as investor shareholder, and as direct owner of capital and assets. Now, to give you, or to put a bit of empirics on this argument, I'll now move to a few empirical points to explain what really we're interested in this book. So first of all, as of 2024, there were 179 sovereign wealth funds in the world. Sovereign wealth funds, simply put, are state-owned or state-controlled investment funds. And this is a more than six-fold increase since 20 years before. So quite a remarkable increase. Those sovereign wealth funds, control assets worth $12.4 trillion. As you can see here, this is taken from the Financial Times based on data from Global SWF, which is a sort of think tank that monitors the assets controlled by sovereign wealth funds. As you can see, the rise or the expansion of the assets controlled by sovereign wealth funds have also massively increased from about, anyways, I'll just continue. So this is more than hedge funds and private equity firms combined. So again, we're talking about huge sums of money here. As you may expect, some of you will know that the largest sovereign wealth fund is the Norwegian one. And indeed, this is a massive sovereign wealth fund, which is significantly bigger than the other ones. And as you may expect, most large sovereign wealth funds are located in East Asia and in the Middle East. There's also the Singaporean sovereign wealth fund in there, GIC Private Limited. However, this story is also a global story. This is not limited to simply those two regions. A lot of countries across the world and across all continents have created over the past 10 to 15 years sovereign wealth funds. So here's a few examples in this slide. We've got a fund in Morocco, Senegal, Egypt, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Angola, Malaysia, Ireland, France, Italy, Indonesia, and so on. You may know that the UK is also working on launching its national wealth fund, the US as well. Both administrations have been discussing for a while now the creation of an American sovereign wealth fund, which is quite interesting too. In addition to that, we've also seen a remarkable revival of state-owned enterprises over the past 20 years. Now that is quite interesting insofar, neoliberalism and the move towards privatization from the 80s onwards was predicated on the argument that state-owned enterprises were a thing of the past, that they were inefficient, and that they were all destined to be privatized and would disappear as economies would modernize and become more efficient. But in fact, what we've seen over the past 10 to 20 years is a revival of those state-owned enterprises. Again, the story is global here, so a lot of people would say, well, this is just because of the rise of China, and there is some truth to that. But as you can see on this map, which is from the IMF, there's plenty of state-owned enterprises, including incredibly powerful ones, again, in other regions as well, including in Europe. So over the past decade, they have doubled in importance amongst the world's 2,000 largest firms. The biggest ones account for 20% of those largest firms, which is quite remarkable. They control about $45 trillion of assets, which is equivalent to half of global GDP according to the IMF. So again, we're talking about huge sums of money here. What's also interesting is that they're active across a very wide range of sectors. So you may expect those state enterprises to be active in things like public utilities or energy, but they're also active in transport, construction, heavy industry, advanced manufacturing, and so on. And finally, and this is quite important too, they've become increasingly global entities. A lot of them actually operate like privately owned transnational corporations. They're sometimes as efficient as those. They compete very effectively against those privately owned corporate entities. So at the same time as we've seen the rise of sovereign wealth fund state enterprises, we've also seen a return to fashion of another type of state-owned corporate entities, which is national development and policy banks. They vastly expanded their loan portfolio and financial capacities in both advanced capitalist economies and the global south over the past 20 years. According to a recent estimate by the Public Banking Project, there's more than 900 public banks, or state-owned banks, I should say, worldwide, and they control assets worth $57 trillion. This is a bit old, so the picture is probably even more significant now, but this is from the OECD in 2016, sorry. As you can see, again, the picture is a global one. You see a lot of state-owned banks in so-called emerging economies, but also middle-income economies and advanced capitalist economies. Here's a couple of interesting books to read on that if you're interested. Okay, in addition to all that, we've also seen a proliferation of techno-industrial policies and national development strategies, again, in both the global north and in the global south. Typically in the global north, those policies try and develop things like advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, 5G, advanced robotics, clean tech, biotech, and so on. Whereas in the global south, we've seen industrial policies which are more oriented towards the development of large-scale connected infrastructure, so things like port, highways, railways, those kind of things. And the point of that is to insert territories and firms into global value chains. But there's also, and more forms of industrial policies and development strategies which are focused or which aim to develop sectors key to the green energy transition, so things like critical transition minerals and green energy. So globally, the rate of adoption of industrial policies is at an all-time high, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. This is an interestingly titled report from the IMF from a few years ago, which says, "The return of a policy that shall not be named, principles of industrial policy." This is sort of saying the same thing. Another report from the IMF, a bit more recent, from earlier this year, which is about tracking mentions of industrial policy in the major business press, which is also sort of giving us a sense of the renewed enthusiasm for industrial policy. As you can see, the trajectory is very clear. And finally, at the same time as all that, we've seen a multiplication of trade and investment restrictions. So this is again from the IMF, which does produce a lot of interesting things. So if you see on the left-hand side, this is basically showing global flows of goods, services, and finance. So this is showing that globalization is not being reversed, but is plateauing, or has been for a few years. However, at the same time, we've seen a very sharp or very rapid increase in trade and investment restrictions. And that includes things like export controls, bans on foreign technology, foreign investment screening mechanisms, capital controls, trade tariffs, sanctions, and so on. To the point that the IMF is now warning against the risks of geoeconomic fragmentation in the world economy. Let me see what I'm doing on time. Okay. Okay, so to wrap up, those are the empirical facts that we're interested in the book. And this is what we refer to as the so-called new state capitalism. So to summarize what I've said, this refers to an expansion of the state's role as promoter of capital accumulation, but also as investor, shareholder, and as direct owner of capital and assets. This is happening across the world economy. Of course, in very uneven ways, regionally speaking, but this is a global phenomenon. Or so we argue in the book. This has manifested as, on the one hand, and this is the sort of first leg of state capitalism, if you will, a multiplication of state-owned corporate entities with a few things that I've discussed earlier. And on the other hand, the development of what we call muscular forms of statism that include techno-industrial policies, national development strategies, and trade and investment restrictions. So what's interesting too, of course, is that we've seen a combined expansion of those two things, right? So you could argue that any individual policies or institutional forms that you can see there are interesting in themselves, but what we've seen is a combined expansion of those two things. And again, this has happened across the world and across territorial borders as well. So the question we try and address in the book are, why is this happening? How to explain this phenomenon, and what are its implications? So, you know, this is quite a dense and rich book. We cover a lot in the book, and I'm not going to have a chance to talk about all the things that we argue, but I'll give you a sense of the main arguments that we make in the time that I have left. Or maybe not. Yes. Okay. Yeah, here we go. So one of the main claims that we make in the book is that this new state capitalism, unlike what the business press, some academics, and Western policymakers say, this new state capitalism is not a new model of capitalism coming from the East or the South. It is actually a product of global political economic transformations over the past 2 decades. In other words, this new state capitalism is about how the state, or multiple states in the world economy, have adapted to the historical development and transformation of global capitalism over the past 2 decades. So I'll give you a sense of the 4 main economic transformations that we discuss in the book, and then I'll explain how that relates to the story of state capitalism. So let me go quickly through those global political economic transformations. The first one is the geographical reconfiguration of the global economy. So many of you will be familiar with the story of the formation of global value chains over the past 20 years. But what's interesting is that arguably the world capitalist economy was born in the long 16th century. And from then, up until about 20 years ago, the center of gravity of the global economy was the North Atlantic. Now, what has happened over the past 20 years is something of world historic consequences, which is that this center of gravity has pivoted eastwards towards the Pacific Rim. This is a major recalibration in geographical terms of the global economy, and we argue in the book and we document at length how this has required states to massively intervene in order to facilitate the emergence of this new pattern of uneven development. And this has involved directly intervening in the economy, but also remobilizing state ownership, so things like development banks, state enterprises, and so on, as a means to facilitate this new pattern of uneven development. So think, for instance, about the type of investment in massive, large-scale connective infrastructure that is required to mediate this, the flow of commodities, people, services, capital, information, and so on, to facilitate this new pattern of uneven development. So that is the first global political economic transformation that we discussed. The second one is sort of related to that, is the question of what mainstream economists call secular stagnation. So this is the idea that the world economy has entered a period of slowing rates of growth, low rates of investment, and low labor productivity growth. Again, this is something that has been widely observed to different degrees across the world economy. So there's spaces and regions where this has manifested much strongly than in other regions. Typically, advanced capitalist economies have been much more affected by that than some more rapidly growing emerging economies. But nonetheless, overall, the picture is quite explicit, and indeed we've witnessed a secularly slowing global economy. Now we don't need to get into the reasons for that now, but again the point that we make in the book is that as a result of that, states have been compelled to intervene way more. And we go through a range of examples and regions where we look at how states have tried to mitigate that problem in different countries. The third transformation that we look at is related to those previous two, and this is the intensified competition between industrial firms. This has been observed again across a wide range of sectors, and this is a direct consequence of secular stagnation and the geographical reconfiguration of the global economy. This is basically the idea that the global economic pie is not growing as fast, and as a result of that, competition for relative share of the pie is becoming much more intense. This is manifesting through intensified competition in trade, investment, and technology in particular. And again, the point we make in the book is that this is pushing states to intervene way more to support their firms, their national champions, and so on, to help them compete in this much tougher economic environment. And finally, the fourth transformation that we discuss in the book is the turn towards more multipolarity of power and reshuffling of geoeconomics force fields in the global economy. So as you may expect, again, this is a direct consequence of the previous three transformations. Obviously, a world economy which has been geographically transformed has resulted in more economic multipolarity, but also secular stagnation and intensified economic competition has then translated into tougher geoeconomic and geopolitical competition between states. So here too, we argue this transformation has been a driver of additional state intervention in the economy. So I'm going to leave it at there in terms of those global political economic transformations. Let me see. Okay, doing well, I think. But the broad point we make, and we have lots of chapters and lots of case studies to illustrate this, is this. Whoops. States have been compelled to reinvent their roles as supervisors of capital accumulation, but also as capitalists, meaning as direct owners of means of production and as assets, as a result of those transformations. It's a bit slow sometimes. They've developed new modes of intervention and re-embraced state ownership as a result of those processes. And finally, and this is quite important, suspense. No, here we go. Multiple crises have accelerated these transformations in mode of state intervention. So here we sort of intervene in some of the debates about why states are intervening more. So a lot of people are arguing that the global financial crisis of 2008, the COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, supply chain shocks, those kind of things, those crises have pushed states to intervene. And we do not necessarily disagree with that, but we argue that those crises or those crisis events are only catalyzers of deeper structural transformations. So those crises only accelerate transformations that were already at play, which indeed we think are related to much deeper, much more secular, much more world historic transformations. So that's the first part of the argument we make in the book. And I'll be quite quick on the second bit. Yes. The second argument we make is that in order to understand how the new state capitalism develops as a world historic phenomenon, we also need to attend to the individual and collective agency of states. And in particular, various types of geoeconomic relations, we argue, between state actors shape the broader development of state capitalism. So let me unpack that. The argument we make is that there's three types of geoeconomic relations between states that add as an additional catalyzer of state transformations. The first one is what we call competitive emulation. So simply put, this is about states competing with each other, and as they do so, they monitor and scrutinize the actions of their rivals. As they do so, they also strategically adapt to what their rivals are doing. And this, we argue, is a further impetus for state intervention. So just to give you an example, if you think about the policies that a range of states are technologically advanced states are implementing at the moment to foster the production of advanced semiconductors, you can see a very clear example of that. So if you think about Made in China 2025, which was a big industrial program launched in China about almost 10 years ago now, this aimed at developing tech sectors in China, especially the sectors that were at the cutting edge of the technological frontier, including semiconductors. Now, there's been quite some success in the matter, also a lot of failure, but quite some success. As a result of that, the US has recently decided to launch its own US Science and Chips Act as a direct response to what China has done. In response to what the US has done, the European Union has launched its own EU Chips Act, which has then pushed Japan, Korea to launch their own programs of industrial policy to foster semiconductors, advanced semiconductors production. So you can see how competitive emulation is a powerful driver of additional state intervention. The second type of geoeconomic relations that we look at, and which we argue also contributes to the further development of state capitalism, is what we call peer group learning and mimetic behavior. Now, this is about states learning from each other, not necessarily when they directly compete with each other, as during, by contrast with what I described as part of competitive emulation. This is more about states sort of occupying a similar position in the international division of labor or a similar position in the global economy. As a result of that, facing similar issues, political and economic issues, and therefore trying and learn from what other states are doing to address those issues. So for instance, an example we discuss in the book is how a range of African states have taken inspiration from development strategies developed by East Asian countries as well as Latin American countries, took inspiration from that as a means to develop their own national development strategies. We also look at the example of a range of states which have put together task forces in order to study how sovereign wealth funds operate in other countries to sort of mimic those forms of state intervention. So these two, we argue, contributes to the multiplication, to the expansion of this new state capitalism. And finally, we look at a type of relation that we call strategic coupling and mutual reinforcement. So simply put, this is when the increased intervention of a state is enabling further intervention by another state. So here you can think, for instance, about when state-owned a sovereign wealth fund from, say, China or the Middle East would invest in an infrastructure project in an African country, and that country will use this new source of fund to build a national development strategy or a new form of industrial policies. So you can see that there's a direct connection between those forms of intervention, one enabling the development of the other. So this too, we argue, contributes to the expansion of state capitalism. So overall, our argument is that these relations play a powerful multiplier effect insofar as they contribute to the further extension and multiplication of state prerogatives across the world economy. Okay, this is, yes, last slide I have, so wrapping up here. We then discuss in the book some implications of all that, and I'll just give you a quick overview of a couple of those. One is that in an age of catastrophic climate change, state capitalism is likely to further deepen. So you can think about the type of financial dislocations and crises which will be triggered by climate change. You can think about supply chain shocks. You can think about populations being displaced, etc., etc. And you can already see that the green transition and clean tech and those kind of things are becoming a key area of geoeconomic competition between states. So the point here is that climate change is going to accelerate a lot of the transformations that we think are the drivers of state capitalism. In other words, state capitalism is likely here to stay. The second thing we discuss is the relationship between all that and neoliberalism. Now, a lot of people would say that given what I've described, neoliberalism is dead, and the death of neoliberalism has been, proclaimed a lot of times since at least 2008. But what we argue is that the relationship is a bit more complicated than that. I won't go into the details here, but our conclusion, at least so far, is that what we're seeing is not the death of neoliberalism, but more of a mutation of it, where neoliberalism now more aggressively mobilizes commercially oriented state ownership, so a very specific type of state ownership, and also increased state interventionism. So there is a transformation in how the role of the state is conceptualized within neoliberalism, but that doesn't mean that we're moving necessarily beyond it. Another implication which we think is worth discussing is, what we're seeing as a result of all that I discussed so far is a growing fusion of private and state capital and the development of forms of property that collapse the distinction between state and private ownership, control, and management. And that is because a lot of investment blends private and state actors. So this has potential implications for capitalism as a mode of production, insofar that capitalism, as we know it, was predicated upon private property. But as the distinction between public or state and private property becomes harder to make, there's potential interesting question about the new flavor, potentially a new flavor for the capitalism of the future and how it will develop. Okay, last point. Partly as a consequence of what I just said, this new state capitalism inadvertently contributes to repoliticizing the economy and social relations of property. So again, capitalism works by depoliticizing the economy, by constructing it as a separate realm from the state, and this is sort of collapsing insofar as this very visible state intervention and state ownership is challenging this depoliticization of the economy. Now, of course, this is completely inadvertent, but what we argue in the book, and this is where we reflect in a bit more political terms, is that this makes the need for radical democratic experiments with planning and alternative forms of public ownership to reclaim power and control over our collective future even more urgent. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
I will directly give, of course, the floor to Miriam. So
Me first?
Yes, of course.
Thanks, Cecilia, for the kind invitation for this conversation. And also, Professor
Alamis.
That's fine, yeah.
In Portuguese is Elias, okay, for the brilliant lecture and for the book, the significant book. Actually, to start this debate, I won't take the time of the audience, okay, just a little bit. But speaking from a perspective of the Global South, okay, and with Lula now as a president and everything that I'm following since I work for the public sector for 15 years already, and coming from a country that wasn't able to catch up in several technological revolutions and markets that we missed all those times, I was wondering whether this movement of state capitalism could bring some opportunities by mixing a bit this axis north-south, or the opposite, whether it would aggravate inequalities, so making this gap even larger, actually. So in this sense, I would like to bring something that you said in the conclusion, okay, that you didn't mention here. The spiral metaphor that you put in the end, I thought it was very interesting. And I think thinking from a physics way, a spiral coming in a narrow and then become larger, I believe nations are already faster and many of them are lagging behind. So I would like to hear more about inequalities. So when we see this movement, sometimes China is completely different from what Brazil is doing. Of course, your book is not about specifically about one country, but I would like to hear about that. And also brings me for the second point that is related to the institutional capacity of the state. And this is related to my PhD research as well. So, and this is the reality that we see in a state-owned enterprise. So the company that I work in Brazil, we have already 50 years of foundation. And it's not, it needs a long gestation and maturation to deliver results. So it's not like this that we're going to bring money and let's put money and we'll have results. So I'm reinforcing the point that some countries might not be able to keep up with this movement because they don't have those companies, they have to structure these, and it takes a long time for that. But also you mentioned that in your book, and I think it's interesting. And my third point is I would like to hear a little more about the BRICS, because since I don't see one country working alone in this scenario, so I think this movement, of course, it has a lot of problems, but I think it's interesting since they are this huge movement of the BRICS. And to finish and to hear a little bit more from you, what are the next questions that your book is opening for you that in your research lines from now on? Thank you.
So I will just jump in with a small follow-up question, if you can handle them all. And it's also a question actually for Miriam, and I would really like to pick your brain on that because it's about Brazil. And the fact that Brazil does have a lot of state-owned companies, and one by default would somehow assume that state-owned companies will above all operate for the public good, or will operate as a sort of like following, even if it's not for the public good, will follow the current administration desires. And actually, one thing that it's happening as we speak in Brazil is a big internal debate in the government, and because I'm not in the government, I can speak about it. It's a big internal struggle in the Brazilian government that involves Dataprev, for instance, and part of the telecommunications state-owned companies who have a complete capitalist mindset, operate for profits, are actually completely and sold on the private cloud, so-called public, but actually private, from Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and are pushing the Brazilian government to accept agreements with these companies, actually with a layer that would operate on top and generate more costs, offered by where everything passed, let's say, through the state-owned company, but ultimately is stored in and processed through and using services from, and so on and so forth, big U.S. companies. So I was wondering also to what extent you think in your research ultimately that these companies can be a sort of actor that can be mobilized and can change things, because it's not only about the institutional learnings and how long it can take an institution to learn to do things differently, but also that the aims of that institution and those forming the institution may not be those that Lula now wants to develop, or at least some people within Lula's administration and Lula. So just to bring also this other perspective that perhaps we think of state-owned companies as something naturally good, and actually they can even be operating against states when states are trying to do something more progressive. We may afterwards discuss if it's enough or not.
Yes, thank you very much. All great questions. I'll do my best to answer them quickly so that we leave time for Q&As. But okay, I'll take them in order. Thinking from the perspective of the global south and what kind of opportunities are being opened by all that. I think that's a great question, and we do discuss in the book a range of cases where indeed there's states who may appear as being completely unable to participate in any of those transformations, actually have experimented with quite interesting things. So a small country, very poor, like Senegal, for instance, is a country that we've looked at and have done fieldwork in. The realm of experimentation with state enterprises, sovereign funds, different forms of industrial policies, investment in infrastructure, and so on, is quite remarkable given the size of the country, and you may argue the lack of state capacity and so on. That doesn't mean that the question of state capacity is not really important, and I'll come back to it. There's a specific question on that, but what I wanted to say is that as a result of these transformations, things are really being shaken up, and that does open up some space for a remarkable range of policy experimentation. Ilene Grabel has an interesting concept for that. She calls this an area of productive incoherence. So there is also some ideological sort of uncertainty, and that does open space for experimentation with a range of things. But that being said, there is no guarantee that that experimentation would lead to anything good. So in the case of Senegal, for instance, it's been what has been achieved has been extremely exclusive in terms of the class consequences of the model of development that has been underpinned by those new forms of intervention. So yeah, there's I guess my answer is that there's no straightforward reply to this interrogation. Is this an opportunity or more of a constraint? There's a bit of both. What is very clear is that there are some sectors where indeed what advanced economies are doing is they're being much more active than they have been over the previous 20 years perhaps. And so that raises the risks that some of the inequalities in terms of the work that Cecilia does, for instance, on the control of intellectual property and key technologies, core assets, and so on, that the gap would increase even more, obviously, between technologically advanced economies, perhaps some large emerging economies which are best positioned to take advantage of those transformations, and then the rest, really. So there are lots to say on this, but I'll leave it at that. The question of institutional capacity, of course, is key. So you need to have capable states to take advantage of those transformations. There's no way that things could work otherwise. Even states where there's extremely strong institutional capacities, often fail in what they attempt to do, and that's the case of China, that's the case of the US, that's the case of the European Union, France, Germany, and so on. So, so that's one thing. The other thing too is that this is happening and is being shaped by a sort of heavy baggage of at least 20 to 30 years of neoliberal institutional reform, which has hollowed out a lot of state capacity for things like planning and industrial policy making. And as you said, those skills, this knowledge, this capacity, institutionally speaking, takes time to build. So there's cases where those skills had never completely disappeared. They were still dormant within state apparatuses and ministries, and they have been, or there's been attempts at revivifying those dormant skills. But there's also many other cases where states and governments want to do more and find themselves incapable of doing so because they don't have the capacity anymore. And I looked at a case of France and the techno-industrial policies to boost the semiconductor sector, and that's a very brilliant case of that in the sense the state is willing to just pour a lot of money into this. It just doesn't know how to do it anymore. I mean, there's bits, of course, that I don't want to overplay this argument. There's still a lot of interesting things that are being done, but there's a real problem of capacity indeed. Okay, then you had a question on the BRICS. I'm not a BRICS expert or the politics of the BRICS, the internal divisions and so on. What I will say on that is that, if we agree that it would be beneficial for developing states in the global south to try and take advantage collectively of the space that is being created as a result of those transformations, then some forms of formal organization might be necessary. I'm not sure BRICS is the right forum for that. And I'm not too optimistic. Well, I mean, there's no reason to be optimistic about the BRICS, neither from the perspective of it functioning well, but also, even if it functioned well, that it would achieve good things. Yes, and the next questions, I'm not going to say too much on that. I mean, I'm interested in looking more into the question of how the green transition is also sort of adding a new dimension to those transformations. So I'm trying to start a new project on how Morocco and Malaysia, and looking at those comparatively, and how they're trying to finance new green industrial ambitions, developing new forms of industrial policy that try and boost green energy sectors like the green energy, but also, producing semiconductors, for instance, which are specialized or which are targeted to things like solar panels, those kind of things. Yes, and then the question of state enterprises, which I think is also a great question. And one of the things we wanted to do in the book was to break away from the the debate about state intervention bad, state, market good, and vice versa. I mean, that doesn't bring us very far, really. And one of the things, indeed, that we document when we look at a lot of cases of state enterprises that, yeah, they can be terrible too. They can exploit workers better than private-owned entities, etc., etc. They can be extremely good, commercial and profit-oriented capitalist entities as well. So there is no, we shouldn't essentialize state versus private from the perspective of that. Now, what I will say though is that still does open some interesting perspective. I mean, can we design forms of state ownership or public ownership which are better governed, more transparent, more democratic, more responsive to all sorts of needs and publics? I mean, yes, we want to hope so. So which is why we conclude the book on this more political and let's say a bit more optimistic note, which is to say that there is this question of this new state capitalism is repoliticizing the economy and the question of ownership. So it's up to us to think about what can we do with that. Yes.
Thanks a lot again, Ilias. So we will now open the floor for questions here.
Thanks very much. This is really excellent work. So interesting. I've made a note of it. I'm going to download it this evening.
Great.
I'm interested that you didn't mention, because you date it back to like the beginning of the century, and I'm interested you didn't mention like Japan in the mid-20th century with Meiji and all that, followed by Taiwan, similar kind of state channeling of capital, although very big differences as well. South Korea, there are other examples as well, but and the question is, to what extent has this taken root since 2000 as a result of the spectacular success of those, particularly those three countries? And my question is, how successful has this spread of state capitalism been since the 2000 that you indicate? And is there can you say how successful it is? I know making a general answer to that is probably impossible. In fact, it's definitely impossible, but it brings me back to Miriam's question about how effective has it been in the global south? Does it really kind of help to not necessarily narrow the inequalities, but are there kind of emerging giants, East Asia style, that have come about as a result of this change in the last 25 years?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and also congratulations on the launch of your book.
Thank you.
Really also curious to download it and read it later. You mentioned in one of your slides that one of the trigger points for state capitalism is secular stagnation and the slowing rates of growth, investment, and also labor productivity. My question would be around, how do you foresee that the state capitalism is going to be undertaken and tackling these issues? Will it be more reminiscent to shareholder capitalism, or the other way, as in stakeholder capitalism? Will it account for, first of all, how will it calculate this growth, like in a standard measure of GDP, or will it be more enhanced for accounting for different type of metrics, and as well as the productivity, and anything to do with social element of that, with the environmental part, and the well-being in general? So whether you've seen anything of that sort in your research, and which pathway forward the state capitalism going to.
One more?
Yeah. We will take four.
Okay,
And then
four? Wow.
Yes, four.
Thank you very much.
And then you eventually can choose, because we will actually have 3 rounds of questions. So try to be very brief, because we will do 2 here and 1 online.
Yeah, thanks. Just to echo, I think it's a great talk, and I look forward to reading the book. You started at the beginning by saying that, we are witnessing a kind of inflection point of 500 years of a North Atlantic dominance, and a shift in the polarity of where the global economic centre is. And you also gentleman before talked about, this point in the 2000s as this kind of inflection point of where state capitalism is resurgent. You cited a lot of stuff from people like the IMF I'm not sure I saw a World Bank quote on there, but you know, these vanguards of neoliberal reforms, which you talked about a lot. Are you seeing any shift in the rhetoric and the medicine being prescribed by those multilateral institutions, which is acknowledging this shift in state capitalism? You know, do we think we're actually likely to see any change in how they see the world and how they sort of solutionize? Thanks.
And then the gentleman over there, and then we will go back to Elias. But as I told you, you can choose. We will leave you that everyone asks the question, then Elias choose what to reply. Otherwise, it would be impossible.
So, just in the interest of short questions, Donald Trump? Question mark.
Very good one.
You choose that.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much for all great questions and for the kind words on the presentation. So, in response to the first question, which is very good, I think, what we try and do in the book is also historicize this notion of state capitalism. And I didn't say too much about this now, but we don't want to overemphasize the point that some of those institutional forms, you know, industrial policy, state-owned enterprises, policy banks, and all that, those are not new in themselves. They've been used in multiple previous capitalist histories. So you could argue, and we do sort of discuss this in the book, that in the end, all capitalism is state capitalism to some extent. The history of capitalism is probably one history of state capitalism as well, insofar as there's always been a lot of state ownership, a lot of direct state intervention to create, shape, and destroy markets, etc., etc. And yes, the case, you know, the classical East Asian developmentalist experience is a very good historical antecedent to all that. That said, and this is where our argument says something new, we think, is that we ground this resurgence or the resurgence of these institutional forms in historical transformations in global capitalism. Like those are new, the four that I've mentioned. And as a result of those transformations, the resurgence of those very well-known institutional forms takes a new flavor. So state enterprises look very different from what they used to look like. I hinted at that when I said that now many of them operate like transnational corporations, you know, engaging in foreign investment, listing in other countries, and so on and so forth. But yes, so what we're trying to negotiate in the book is some historical depth and have an understanding of state capitalism being a historically very consistent tendency. However, it appears that it's been activated in history at different junctures, and what is indeed activating this tendency at the moment is those four historical transformations that I've discussed. So this is how we bridge, you know, the sort of the argument about historical. It's very ordinary in a way, and the novelty of our current times. How effective in the global south? Well, I guess it depends what you mean by effective. It's true that if you look at just from the perspective of like actual technological catch-up and industrialization and rapidly increasing standards of living and so on, I mean, there's been only very moderate success over the past 20 years of all that. But a range of countries, I mentioned Senegal, I could mention Laos and Nepal, you know, small countries have managed to sort of attract much more investment than they used to as a result of the forces that I've discussed, partly because of also intensified geoeconomic competition between more powerful states. So investing in infrastructure in the global south has become an area of geoeconomic competition. The question, yes, you know, is like success is a very fraught term. So success, according to what and to whom? But there's been some movement. Okay, spending too much time. Secular stagnation. States are very concerned about that, of course, because they're basically dependent on growth. And so when there's no growth or little growth, it creates an economic crisis, political crisis. You know, when there's a welfare state, it doesn't know how to operate, etc., etc. So states are trying to do more and more to address those things. There's the promise of the climate transition being also good for growth, green growth, and blah, blah, blah. This is pursued quite aggressively by a range of states and more. And there is indeed some talks about, yeah, we should, you know, like move away from pure GDP as an indicator and include things like well-being and other things. But this is just gestural. I mean, hardcore economic growth remains the key objective. And that's for structural reasons. It's not because states are poorly inspired. It's because growth is somehow related to capital accumulation, which is the essence and the sort of the living blood of the whole thing. But it's there's a question mark. Will states be able to sort of break this cycle of secular stagnation? Not sure. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. The question, yes, I sort of addressed a little bit that point in the previous answer, but we are at an inflection point, and this is a point we make at length in the book. Your question is very good, and in fact it allows me to elaborate on a chapter which is precisely on that, which is how the World Bank, the OECD, and the IMF in particular, but also other international organizations, have had to adapt their policy prescriptions and their own intellectual production as a result of those transformations, because they've been happening sort of without their seal of approval. States have been experimenting with all of those things by not caring too much about what the IMF and the World Bank says. So they've had to say gradually, well, those things are here to stay, and this is what they write quite literally in reports now on state enterprises, policy banks, and so on. They used to write things like, those things will disappear, we should privatize them, we're going to help you privatize those things. Now, they still say some of that, but they also say, we agree that we're aware that those things are here to stay. There's reason why states are re-experimenting with them. We understand that there's concerns about globalizations, etc., etc. And therefore, we're going to help you reform those institutions so that they operate like private sector entities. So there's a slight shift in emphasis in their policy prescriptions. There is some continuity, of course, which is their attempt is to lift obstacle to market forces or the obstacles to capital accumulation, if you want to put it like that. And so they're doing that now by trying to work on how states reform their state enterprises and so on. Donald Trump, that's a great question. I'm not too sure what to say on this because, on the one hand, I could say that from the first Trump administration to then Biden, there was more continuity than change from the perspective of the stuff that I've discussed. So let's see really what will happen with the third. But I don't see any potential significant break with the turn to more aggressive forms of industrial policies, the multiplication of trade and investment restrictions. I mean, those are likely to be sort of on steroids with Trump, which may only deepen some of the transformations that I talked about. But it remains unclear how other states will react to that. So yeah, I don't want to venture too much on this, but I think that's a great question and we should talk about it more.
Let's get the mic back and we move to this side. We have 2 questions here up front and then 2 more on this side.
Thank you very much, Elias, for your talk and for publishing the book. And my question was really surrounding the intended framing of it. Because from the title, it seems that it's making a very emphatic statement about the potential disastrous consequences of state capitalism. But from the conversation that we seem to be having here today, there seems to be a lot more of a nuanced, balanced conversation to be had about exactly, what state capitalism means and how it's continued across the history of global economic development, but also what the consequences might mean in the future. Because in some senses, it seems that it could be potentially something that could act towards the public good by taking power away from private institutions and putting it into the hands of the public and the state. But also at the same time, that the movement away from neoliberal economic constructs is in itself, by itself, seems to be deemed as a negative direction of travel. So I'm curious as to exactly in what was the intention in framing it as a spectre, and how does this resolve this sort of ambiguity around what state capitalism seems to have come to mean, given its history? And looking towards the future, does that mean that that the economic system should be looking to move towards greater state capitalism, or is it something that we need to hedge our developments towards? Thank you.
That was 3 questions. Just kidding.
Take your pick.
Okay, so thank you very much. Very inspiring presentation. Thank you. I would like to go back to the institutional aspect Miriam mentioned before, and talking about Western countries, like apparently we are facing a crisis in political representation in Western countries, with less re-elections, a lot of political instability, where we can see what is going on in the US. And So my question is, isn't that a threat to an objective for this, for example, public funds, in terms of maybe, there's a change in political party, a couple of years ago, the objective, the intention of the funds would be the same and would remain the same, no matter which political party is in the government. But nowadays there's a lot of polarization, and I would think about many countries, for example in South America, with political parties that would agree on this politics and other public policies, and many others that wouldn't.
Yeah.
So in an autocracy, or maybe in Asian countries, that is not a problem, but with elections every 2 or 4 or 6 years, isn't that a threat or a problem to this state capitalism? Thank you.
Thanks. My question is actually quite related to that. I'm thinking again about Western economies, Western democracies. But in terms of, is there any indication of what you've seen that voters have been interested in driving this to occur? Or is this just a preoccupation of the political classes in terms of why this has come about? You mentioned that there's an opportunity now for democracy to think about what to do with it, but have voters had anything to do with this arising in the first place?
Thank you, Dr. Alami. I'm a student from University of Manchester, and I have a question about your new book. And as far as I know, in the chapter 6 in your book, you mentioned that there is a great organizational change about state-owned enterprises, especially in China. For example, they go to the global capital market to raise some money and so that they can expand their business and maybe do a spatial fix. And but to be honest, in China there are two kinds of views. Firstly, they think the trend is about just as you say in your book, state is back and state is play a more important role in the economy. And but on the other hand, some people think the trend is about the privatization, I think, because they have, for example, they give us the data, the ownership, I think the state ownership is just 40% now in China, and 20 years ago, this number is about 60%, so they think maybe state is not back, is going away and away. And what do you think about these two kinds of different views? Oh, I have a follow-up question. Do you think we should problematize the state capitalism? It's not just about the ownership, but a more complex relationship. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
We stop there with the questions that are now like 10.
Yes. All right, I'll take them in reverse order then. Thank you for your question. We've been in touch by email before. So, yes, so I don't want to suggest, because this is not what we argue in the book, that the movement is only about more state ownership everywhere. There's ebb and flow, but there's a tendency for more ownership in general, more state ownership in general. Now in China, as I'm not an expert at all on Chinese political economy, but having looked at the question a little bit, there's been different movements at play. So there was a movement about 20 years ago where indeed the tendency was to privatize a lot of state-owned enterprises, but while always keeping strategic state control over state enterprising in some sectors, or even when almost privatizing entirely some state enterprising, retaining things like golden shares and so on. So as a means to experiment with different modes of property, to retain some state property in mostly privatized enterprises. And that has been, so this is very clear in the Chinese case, but it's also observable in other countries too. So I guess the broader point is that given the structures of ownership that exist now for most state enterprises are very complex, and we've moved away quite drastically from the classical mode of governance, which was fully owned by the state or majoritarily owned by the state. now there's a whole spectrum of governance structures and ownership structures that can be very sophisticated, and also that answer different political purposes. So you might have sectors where the state decides to retain a minority take in an enterprise for a particular purpose, or simply a golden share because they want to prevent that firm from making some decision, for instance, accepting investment from a foreign country. So there's all sorts of political objectives that can be achieved by adopting a wide range of structures of ownership and governance. And it's always it can be a bit difficult to extrapolate too much when we appear to see a sort of trend like in China, where some people have argued that you have very clear tendency toward more state ownership and then less state ownership, and so on and so forth. There's like sophisticated ways through which the state can maintain control by embracing some private capital and private participation in firms. Okay, leave this one there. Are voters interested in pushing for some of that stuff? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think one thing I should say is that, of course, I talked about those transformations and trends in very general terms. So I took a very bird's eye view on those transformations. But all of this is of course, grounded in different, and local configuration of political forces and social forces and so on. And some of those, the experimentation with state enterprises, sovereign wealth fund, and so on, sometimes has been harnessed for more autocratic purposes. Sometimes that has taken place in ostensible democratic regimes. So it's a bit difficult to generalize about what kind of forces are pushing, what kind of political forces are pushing for those things. They can be, different kind of intentions and projects can be attached to those things. That being said, and this is where I'm going to do a little rejoinder to the last point I make, because of this repoliticization of property and repoliticization of the economy, there's been a lot of interesting proposals from a range of, let's say, progressive forces and civil society organizations. There's plenty of NGO. An interesting case is Commonwealth here in the UK, which is a sort of progressive think tank, which is doing brilliant work about how we can design forms of public ownership which are agile and responsive to the needs of citizens, but also so that they can catalyze a quick green transition. And of course, their project doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's because of those material transformations and the kind of ideas that this triggers. So, yeah. But that being said, most of that stuff is indeed more top-down and driven by elites in various class and various economic and political elite interests. Yes, the question about political instability and polarization and the impact on the stuff that I talked about. That is a very interesting question. And when we started writing the papers, which then would lead to that book about 5 years ago or a bit more, a lot of people were telling us, and most of those people were from Latin America, that the pink tide is down now. There's been a backlash against it in most of those places. So this trend is being reversed. But the story is more complicated than that, we think, and there is a level of, you could argue that there's places where you would have a lot of pushback against some of those forces for political reasons, but their embedding in those structural transformations mean that it's often hard, even for let's say free market ideologues and neoliberals and so on. A lot of the posturing around we don't want the state to do stuff is strongly being challenged by the fact that there's material needs for the states to do a lot more stuff as a result of the transformations that I discussed around. So there's a lot of compulsions, which is pushing a lot of people who would be very reluctant to experiment with those institutional forms to do way more than they would in more conventional times, if you will. So that's one thing I would say about polarization. There is a problem, though, in terms of the instability and the lack of consistency that creates for for some of those forms of intervention, like industrial policies that require some strategic vision and planning and so on, and the short political cycles are a big problem for that. And the UK is a great example for this, because the Theresa May government 6 or 7 years ago was trying to experiment with forms of industrial policies which were very much in line with some of the stuff that I talked about. But then, the what's his face? Boris Johnson after that kind of completely sabotaged those efforts. Yeah, those efforts. So the political instabilities can be a big obstacle to those transformations, and the kind of coherence and consistency that they need to have to be minimally effective. Yeah, and now the new Labour government is reading a bit what they're producing, like their discourses and the various briefing notes and so on. They're trying to do a lot more, which relates to that, but they're really struggling to, because they lack imagination. They sort of look around a bit at what has been done, but there's something is missing. Anyways, lots to say about that too, but I'll probably need to stop here. Yes, and the title of the book, that's a good question too. We played a bit with that in the sense that indeed, this new state capitalism is perceived as a threat for a lot of people. They see this as a purely negative phenomenon because markets are being distorted, and they associate that to democratic backslide and those kind of things. But we were very far away from any normative position on those questions. To me, I see that as a matter of reflection from a political perspective. As does this open interesting opportunities for progressive politics? What can we do about all those things? That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in saying sovereign wealth fund good or bad, or state enterprises good or bad, those kind of questions. But the choice of the title was a bit provocative to indeed speak to the people who indeed perceive that as quite as a negative development. Now we have a more sophisticated argument about the notion of Spectre in the book, and I'm not going to say too much on that here. But it's basically, we use it as a sort of device to reflect in the conclusion about the potential transformation of capitalism as a result of a potential deepening of state capitalism. And the Spectre here is sort of a lingering presence. It's neither fully here, but it's kind of potentially here. So it's in that sense that we try and play a bit with that notion. And again, it's without any sort of normative judgment, and this is not supposed to be something haunting us or looming, or yeah.
Precisely, let me jump there in there, because we really want to get some of the questions from the people online also here to discuss with you. Mm-hmm. And precisely about the threats, there is one question about whether this new state capitalism is likely to increase the possibility that the second Cold War will morph into the third global hot war. Then there are a few questions about how your thesis intersects with discussions about coloniality and racial capitalism. And then I will just pick one more for the sake of time, which is the first one that came to the Q&A here on the Zoom link, which is how important is it for states to own the digital infrastructure on which their digital information resides? Is the move to rely on corporate cloud infrastructure a wrong turn?
Okay. Yeah, all great questions too. Thank you very much for that. Owning the digital infrastructure, you should answer that question.
I will answer it. I picked it and I read it by the end because I will answer the question while I say bye and thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll leave you answer this one. I don't think I have too much to say on it anyways. Coloniality and racial capitalism. Well, in the sense of, of course, this is really important to the development that we discuss in the book, but we've not used any of those terms as a lens or as a framework to tackle the questions that we've asked. Now, of course, yeah. So I don't want to go too much, to spend too much time on that. Besides saying that, speaking back to a topic we've discussed earlier, which is the possibility or the ability of some states to take advantage in the global south to take advantage of those transformations or not as an opportunity. Well, of course, that partly depends on colonial or neo-colonial or post-colonial relations that they have with a range of other countries. And you can think of cases where indeed those act as a strong impediment to states being able to experiment with more policy tools. But there's also other cases where states in the post-colonial world have been quite agile at negotiating relationships with formal imperial powers. The case of Morocco is quite interesting here, where Morocco, the state, has been really smart at renegotiating its relationship with the old colonial power France, but also negotiating new relations with China, the US, the UAE, and other partners, and this has led to a diversification of the sources of external finance, which is now proving quite helpful to fund green industrial ambitions. Yeah, and I'm not saying this is good. This is in fact this is not benefiting most people in Morocco at all, and Morocco has its own colonial relation with Western Sahara and so on. But all of this to say that yes, coloniality of course matters to those questions because it always matters. The Second Cold War, yes. So we are writing a paper with a few comrades, which is trying to think about the kind of geopolitics which are fostered by those transformations, and how that might relate to the so-called Second Cold War, or the new Cold War that is developing between China, the US, and other regional powers. And there is no doubt that some of those transformations actually increase or intensify geoeconomic tensions, which might then translate into enhanced geopolitical tension, so that might add fuel to the fires, so to speak. So, yes, I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks everyone again for being here. I will replay the other question, although I'm just the chair here, and I will try to be very brief. The first thing that I would like to say regarding the issues of what states should be doing in relation to digital technologies is that with different colleagues, we're precisely, actually I know that I have just a few hours ago received the final version of a white paper that we will be publishing in, like, I hope a week or 10 days, precisely that aims at providing concrete and integrated policy recommendations for expanding digital sovereignty. It addresses several things, but it has a core and fundamental recommendation, which is precisely that we should try to aim at building public-led clouds. And this not only refers to the digital infrastructure, the material parts, and I say material parts and emphasize because there is a term out there that Bill Gates particularly likes a lot with this digital public infrastructure and may lead to confusions, because that refers to universal platforms that lie on top of the material part, on top of the data centers, the cables, and so on and so forth, that are highly concentrated by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google in particular. But the cloud is also a marketplace for computing services, which means that even the leading companies in the world are migrating to the cloud and being locked in and dependent on big tech, on 3 companies. So if even the largest companies in the world that are not these 3 become locked into the cloud, and they do it in part because that enables them to use, without really having access to technologies that better control their workers, that better control their global value chains, the franchisees that they have. So it's a strategy to control better those from below. It's a strategy also to produce new intangibles that reinforce their power. So it's a strategy that ultimately these other leading corporations are choosing, even though they know they get more locked in, for a state. And think about all the things that the state does, giving all your healthcare data and all your capacity to operate the hospitals to a big tech cloud, education, even the military. I mean, this is significantly going to prevent any state from building an alternative. And it's also extremely dangerous, the type of partnerships that this can lead, and is already leading. Think of Project Nimbus as an example in Israel, and how it has helped the Israeli state to target Palestinians. This is a project that was of design of cloud infrastructure in Israel by Amazon and Google. And it was through part of their employees that we found out that actually this is not, of course, technology is never neutral, it's always political and has certain aims. And in this case, it was targeting Palestinians with AI. So definitely in any project of trying to build more sovereign states and giving sovereignty to the people, and also thinking in terms of the ecological footprint of the cloud, absolutely the answer to that question is yes, we need public-led solutions. Having said that, that cannot work at one state level, and I think that going back to what all your research leads us to reflect on, and going back to the role that multilateral organizations have had so far, I think we really need to push, in particular the UN, because it's the only space where I think that there is still certain space to push for organizations that precisely if we institutionalize things at the international level, perhaps at the UN level, we can also overcome these limitations that we've seen at the national level with changes in governments, with far right getting more space. And also in the case of digital technologies, taking into account that all the data that is hoarded by big tech then is also offered at different prices to states around the world to surveil their people. So definitely, yes, public solutions also with these caveats. And with this, thanks everyone for being here. It was an amazing, very stimulating discussion. I knew it was going to be like that, but it exceeded my expectations. Thanks both of you and all of you here for the questions and participating, and have a nice evening.